Don't comic books make you really disappointed in our real-life billionaires? Oh sure, Iron Man had his fair share of drug overdoses and sex scandals, but at least he channeled his chaotic energy into saving the world rather than destroying it. And sure, Batman... Well, actually, wait, there's no negatives there. If you have the kind of money to be Batman, why would you not be Batman? Anyway, reality is often disappointing, and while we've never had anything like a Batman parallel in real life, we did come pretty close to an Iron Man parallel in Howard Hughes. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that Stan Lee was thinking of the real-life genius billionaire playboy philanthropist in his lifetime when creating the character of Tony Stark. Except scratch that last part. In fact, run that by me again.
Genius billionaire playboy.
Opioid addict, corrupter of government officials, war profiteer, megalomaniac.
Right, that's better. Actually, Tony's dad in the movies looked a whole lot like him as well. What was his name again?
Coincidence? I think not!
Yeah, that's not a coincidence. He was absolutely named after Howard Hughes. The real-life dad in our story, Howard Hughes Sr., or Bo, was one of the first big names in the early 20th century Texas oil boom. He founded the company that would later become known as Texaco. He created the Hughes drill bit in 1909, which revolutionized the drilling process and made it so that his competitors in the oil industry had to buy parts from his own tool company in order to stay competitive. Details of Howard Hughes Jr.'s early life are hard to come by because, well, he forged them. He forged his whole life's story. In later years, the richest man in the world would attempt to mythologize himself, telling fanciful stories about the circumstances surrounding his birth, and he changed his birthday to Christmas Eve.
Sure, sometimes we eat the yellow snow, but at Christmas time, it tastes just a little bit better.
Was he one of triplets, with the other two would-be heirs to his father's fortune hidden away from the world to never be able to claim their inheritance, just like those two cousins of the former British Queen who were locked in a mental asylum their entire lives? And why do people not talk about them more often? What was I talking about? Was he the illegitimate son of his aunt, simply raised by his mother and father? Or was he a substitute baby, brought in to replace a stillborn child, with his birth mother paid off to never speak of it again?
Sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes another. If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice.
All of these stories and more were things that Hughes would in later years tell to further the mythos surrounding himself. And you'll notice that each and every one of those stories further distances himself from being the legitimate heir to his father's fortune. And I can understand why. Thinking of all of the richest and most powerful people in the world today, they are not succeeding based on their own skills and ingenuity. They are simply building upon generational wealth that they have had since birth. But I do genuinely believe that Howard Hughes would have ended up where he is either way, and maybe not no matter the circumstances he was born into, but at the very least, provided he had a family who could send him to a school with a halfway decent mechanical engineering program. It just, without the family fortune, he would have had to actually graduate college.
I see now that the circumstances of one's birth are
extremely
relevant.
At 11 years old, he put together a wireless radio transmitter. Yeah, not a receiver, not a radio, a transmitter, as in he could broadcast to his local area.
Let me see what you have!
live electric wires.
No! Oh my God.
The very next year, Houston, Texas got its very first motorcycle, because the 12-year-old Howard Hughes built one. Guys, the motorcycle was still a new concept, and it was built by a 12-year-old. There were only a handful of them in the entire country at the time. I hope you're starting to see the Iron Man parallels here. In 1920, a certain oil baron took his son to the Charles River in Massachusetts where they would watch the Harvard versus Yale rowing crew races. And he told him if their team, Harvard, won, he would buy him anything in the world that he wanted. And yes, I do understand that is the most privileged sentence a person could possibly say. They did win, and rather than ask his dad for, I don't know, a private island, that house from the dream world in The Sandman, or boatloads of that one ingredient they were still using in Coca-Cola at the time, he simply asked his dad for a ride on a nearby flying boat. Side note, powered flight itself had only been first achieved in 1903, 17 years before this. And now flying boat rides were being offered for $5. I don't think I'd be comfortable getting on any flight pre the 1950s. For Howard Hughes, this short tourist attraction had shown him the direction he wanted to take the rest of his life in. He had no intention of ever taking over his father's businesses. Aviation was his life's passion. His mother died due to complications from an ectopic pregnancy when Hughes was 16. 2 years later, his father would die from a heart attack. At the age of 19, Hughes dropped out of college and became legally an emancipated minor so that he could have access to his own money rather than it being locked away in a trust until he was older. Executives ran both Hughes's oil and tool companies separately from him. The empire his father had built, a mere piggy bank for Hughes to build upon whatever he wanted. So what did he choose to do with all of that money first? He, produced and directed a bunch of movies?
Everybody comes to Hollywood.
Yeehaw. Howard Hughes' first movie was called Hell's Angels. No, not them. They didn't exist back then. No, not them either. They don't exist at all. No, it was about planes because, of course, it was about planes. World War I pilots, to be specific. To film, Hughes hired an air fleet of stunt pilots bigger than the Air Force most countries had at the time. He planned to write, direct, produce, and to some extent star in the movie since he never gave up an opportunity to get in the cockpit. While Hughes was up in the air scouting for a place to shoot some footage, his plane went into a tailspin for reasons unknown. He came out of the crash barely injured, but I'm gonna put a counter right here for reasons you'll see later. One of these stuntmen was quoted as saying, well, at least he hasn't injured his check-writing arm. The movie was enormously over budget, taking $4 million to film in 1927 money, though it would end up making it back in droves due to the clear passion Hughes put into the project. The massive cast of stunt pilots weren't the only reason for the inflated cost, however. Hughes himself was a problem. He was a major control freak, a pattern of behavior you'll find caused him major problems throughout his entire life. He'd have them reshoot entire scenes for such trivial things like the clouds were not in the right pattern when the planes were flying by. There's this apparently groundbreaking movie I've never seen before called The Jazz Singer that released during the filming of Hell's Angels.
You like jazz?
It was the first feature-length sound movie ever released, and it was extremely popular. And Howard Hughes believed that it would make any silent movie released afterward feel outdated and not do very well at all. So rather than just sticking to the plan, Hughes had them throw everything out and start over. He also recast their main actress, from a famed silent-era film actress who had a heavy Norwegian accent to someone who sounded a bit more American. The new up-and-comer was named Harleen Carpenter and would soon be known all over the world by her stage name Jean Harlow. They hated each other, by the way, Harlow and Hughes, though it would seem she's one of the very few who ever did, considering over his long career he would end up dating, among others, Joan Crawford, Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, and Hedy Lamarr. Whoa, wait, Hedy Lamarr? As in famed silent-era film actress and also inventor of radio technology designed to interrupt the remote control of guided missiles and also was a major stepping stone in the creation of Wi-Fi, that Hedy Lamarr? I kinda wish that relationship lasted longer so we could see what kind of genius kids the two of them could have had. Honestly, why don't I just make this whole video about her? Maybe some other time. In Hughes' spare time away from crashing planes on movie sets, he was busy crashing cars on the Hollywood Strip. He struck and killed a pedestrian in 1936. The official story changed several times over the next few days, whether or not Hughes was driving drunk, whether or not the guy was crossing properly at the crosswalk or ran out randomly in front of Hughes, how fast Hughes was going. Even the man who conducted the autopsy had a different story on the day he performed the autopsy versus several weeks later. Man, money really changes a person's memory, doesn't it? Anyway, add it to the counter. The next successful movie Howard Hughes made, because there were several flops in the meantime, was a little-known movie called Scarface.
Say hello to my little friend!
No, not that one, that's a remake. It was a bold move considering Al Capone, the person the movie was based off of, had only been sent to jail for tax evasion that very year. He still had people on the outside, is all I'm saying. The release of this movie would not go smoothly, however. The MPAA refused to endorse it, citing the massive amounts of mob violence it depicted. Hughes ended up winning a lawsuit allowing him to accurately depict the mob violence that the movie was about. And so right after getting away with depicting accurate mob violence on screen, Hughes decided to push the envelope as far as possible, resulting in The Outlaw starring Jane Russell. "We're not getting enough production out of Jane's breasts," was an actual quote from Hughes while working on this movie, which tells you all you need to know about the movie itself as well as the work environment while filming. Russell would end up being one of the few leading ladies Hughes never dated, but reportedly not for lack of trying on Hughes' part. If you have ever heard of The Outlaw before, it's probably in a class talking about the Hays Code, the thing that censored all of Hollywood for the better part of 40 years, and how this was a major stepping stone in its implementation. Though The Outlaw would eventually be shown in theaters, it was denied a certificate of approval by the MPAA for many years and would have to be heavily censored before release. In 1948, Hughes bought RKO Pictures, one of the big five Hollywood studios at the time, alongside MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and Fox. He immediately fired 700 employees and shut the place down for 6 months, and only opened again once thorough investigations proved to him that none of the remaining employees harbored any communist sympathies. You'll notice on that list of the big five studios, all of the ones Howard Hughes didn't own still exist to this day. Anyway, back to planes. While golfing at an LA country club, because of course that's what a billionaire was doing, a biplane flew by and tipped its wing at Hughes. And as any rational person does, Hughes dropped what he was doing, ran after it, tracked the guy down, and offered him $100 a day to teach him to fly. Let's see, how much is that in today's...
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
In 1932, in a tiny rented-out corner of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation hangar in Burbank, California, Hughes established the Hughes Aircraft Corporation as a subsidiary of the Hughes Tool Corporation. Then, to get more experience than the biplane pilot could give him, he got a job at American Airlines under the pseudonym Charles Howard, working first as a baggage handler and then working his way up to the rank of co-pilot, which... Hold on a second. Does that mean they gave someone who they already knew had the qualifications to fly planes the job of baggage handler? Or did they knowingly give someone who had no qualifications the job of co-pilot? I'm not quite sure which is more concerning. Moving on. Hughes built the H-1 Racer in that tiny little Lockheed alcove in his spare time away from his new blue-collar job, winning his first airplane race in Miami in 1934. Within a few months, his business could boast the fastest plane in the world, setting a new airspeed record of 352 miles per hour on August 18, 1935, near Santa Ana, California. 2 years after that, his company could boast the fastest transcontinental flight, going from Burbank, California to Newark, New Jersey in 7 hours and 28 minutes. Oh, and did I see his company held these records? No, I meant him, Howard Hughes, personally. Hughes flew his own planes, and crashed them because while going for that second record, he crashed for his second time, well, third if you count the car crash as well. Anyway, just add it to the counter. It's a good thing he was wearing this, even though it's very uncomfortable. This is literally just a backpack, not a parachute, but imagination. Soon after setting that record, Hughes would buy a controlling stake in Transworld Airlines, one of two major commercial aviation businesses in the US at the time. That's another thing that sets him apart from modern-day billionaires. He, well, actually did things. Hughes had passions and genuine skills and talent for a field, and used his money to further that field. He made sure he was the test pilot for every plane he personally designed, and he was their stunt pilot for when they set off to break records. A person like, say, Elon Musk knows absolutely nothing about what his own companies are doing, and in interviews constantly makes up wild nonsense that his employees have to come out later and make public statements to contradict. People think he's smart and important, because he was born rich, and he has purchased companies where very smart people do very important work that he knows nothing about. Howard Hughes was the Hughes Aircraft Company. Their lead designer, their chief electrician, their head mechanic, their test pilot, their everything. Every inch of every aircraft was to his specifications, and they flew solely for him to see what he could do with the skills and resources he had. So Hughes is the fastest man alive. Where did he go from here? You know that one Jackie Chan period piece? No, the one where he goes around the world running away from an assassin clan. No, the one that's based off a really old book. It's Around the World in 80 Days. I'm trying to get at... Never mind. Hughes' next goal after the fastest cross-country trip was the fastest trip around the world. A Lockheed Super Electra, a plane that Hughes in fact did not build, took off from New York City on July 10, 1938. First, they flew directly over Katharine Hepburn's home in Connecticut, as she and Hughes were dating at the time. Then Hughes took out this newfangled device that would figure out exactly where and when in the world they were at any given time, and use it to navigate all the way to Paris, France. It was a GPS, the very first time a civilian aircraft was fitted with it. Lieutenant Thomas Thurlow, an Army pilot who was able to use the recently declassified technology, was on the plane with them. The first of many partnerships between Hughes and the US military, and the least concerning. They would stop again in Moscow, twice again in two absurdly cold places that probably also have names: Fairbanks, Alaska, Minneapolis, before again touching down in New York City. Around the world in 3 days, 19 hours, and 17 minutes. And that's where the record stands today. No, I'm just kidding. Of course it isn't. Nowadays, astronauts on board the ISS go around the world every 90 minutes, seeing about 16 sunrises and sunsets per day. 16 days per day. 16 days squared.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what do I mean this wouldn't be the last time Hughes partnered with the US military? And where did all the Iron Man parallels go? It's been a while since I mentioned that, haven't I? Well... there were some other things going on in the world in 1938. In fact, I'm glad he flew in 1938 because 2 years later, and I would advise heavily against refueling in Paris, France, or really flying over Europe at all on your round-the-world trip. The Second World War was a great time, provided you were a filthy rich American investor who was neither Japanese nor Jewish. Technology advanced so fast that basically the precursor to everything you use in your daily lives was invented then, thanks to massive government contracts as well as spies embedded in every lab, think tank, and factory in the world. We leaped forward as a species by decades in just a few short years, all culminating into people who had yet to learn what those little squiggly things in the nucleus of our cells were for. Doing, well, this. And what did all that human suffering mean for the world's richest and most powerful people?
Money, money, money.
See, this is why I say he's the closest thing we've ever had to Iron Man. Not necessarily because of the heroics, he kinda dropped the ball there, but you know Tony Stark, the war profiteer from the beginning of the movie? Before changing his entire outlook on life due to suffering horrible trauma? Yeah, that was just a real guy. So the feds came knocking on Hughes' door.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Asking him to build planes for the war effort. They threw millions of dollars at him in government funds, expecting the genius aviation innovator to revolutionize flight as he had done so many times before. Their money came with one major stipulation. No raw materials that were already being used for the war effort could be diverted into Hughes' plane designs. That basically means he had to build planes without metal. His solution? Duramold is a technique where thin strips of birch are held together with layers of resin. Yeah, these were planes made out of birch. Wood. They're trees. They're trees that fly. Though, now that I'm thinking about it, is that really any more impressive than rocks that fly, or for that matter, rocks that can think and feel? There are two different stories to tell here, because, well, there are two different wooden plane designs that Hughes promised the government at the start of the war. They were each meant to solve different problems. One of them had to be big, bigger than any other plane ever built, able to resupply the front lines with food, reinforcements, and even tanks. The other plane needed to be fast, faster than any other plane ever designed, in order to fight the war itself and outmaneuver the Germans. Hughes, being known for his plane's speed by this point in his career, first designed a spy plane, a photo reconnaissance plane designed to get in, take pictures, and get out, called the D-5.
Hit. I hit. You have sunk my battleship.
100 of these designs were bought by the US government and were supposed to be ready to fly in early 1943. They weren't. Several redesigns and months of Hughes sitting alone in a room surrounded by crumpled up pieces of paper later, and the government was getting anxious about what was being done with their money. A visit from FDR's son, who was greatly impressed with what he saw, kept the project from losing its funding. But the work would not pick up from there, despite growing presidential pressure for Hughes to get his wood aloft. What was the reason for all of the delays? Well, it was the same reason that Hell's Angels had to be completely reshot from the ground up. Hughes's crippling OCD had reared its ugly head, costing the project years and the government millions. As Hughes insisted every single solitary detail had to be done by him, and redone, and reworked, and redesigned, and retested, and suddenly World War II was over without a single plane to show for it.
Have I missed it? Have I missed the battle? You have missed the war.
Now, Hughes argued that his new design still had military use going forward, and now that the war was over, he could actually incorporate metal into the design, though the new XF-11 would still be mostly Duramold. Hughes wasn't happy his previous project had not taken off. Same. And while I certainly wouldn't say he rushed this one, he certainly ignored several common safety features on the day of its inaugural flight. Employees warned Hughes against full tests, warned against testing by himself, warned against anything longer than 45 minutes, warned the landing gear should be fully down and locked into position the entire time, and that he should be keeping in constant contact with the chase plane. Hughes would ignore all of this advice and take to the skies above Beverly Hills. Well, he didn't ignore that last bit on purpose, but radio communication failure with the chase plane meant that Hughes was flying solo, out across the Pacific Ocean as he tried and failed to get the landing gear to retract up into the plane, and one of the propellers went out. Hughes did not know about the propeller going out until it was too late. He thought all of the drag he was feeling was simply because the landing gear was still mostly deployed. He knew he was going to have to make some sort of crash landing without a working landing gear, but he wasn't freaking out. He had been through this many, many times. And unlike me, he was still wearing that parachute bag. It was uncomfortable, I took it off. Hughes headed for a country club because of course he did. Not simply because he wanted to stroll out of the flaming wreckage twirling a cane and immediately play whichever holes of golf were not sectioned off as a crime scene, but also because there would probably be a large enough space for him to land and people would be able to see him coming. He didn't make it that far. And here's some actual footage of the 3 residential buildings Hughes destroyed.
Howard Hughes, famous flyer and sportsman, was dragged out of this wreckage of an experimental plane he was testing. He was seriously injured. After ripping the corner from 2 homes in Beverly Hills, California, the plane finally plunged into this house. The force of the impact virtually wrecked the building and caused the plane to catch fire. The flyer said that the accident was due to motor failure shortly after his takeoff. He failed to make a crash landing on a golf course.
Luckily, unlike his last 2 crashes, there were no fatalities, which is surprising considering, well, this. But this was the big one for Hughes, the crash that he would finally not walk out of unscathed. Severe head trauma, multiple burns, 11 broken ribs. How many ribs does a person even have? Okay, it turns out people have 24 ribs. He still has more than half, he can walk it off. But perhaps the biggest and most lasting result of this crash was the fact that Hughes took major painkillers while recovering. And he never stopped. After the crash of the XF-11, Hughes would find himself addicted to codeine for the rest of his life. On November 2nd, 1947, on Long Beach Harbor, the largest plane that ever flew would have its one and only flight. Yeah, 1947. This one took Hughes even longer than the XF-11. And after that disaster, Hughes had to take out a $5 million insurance policy on himself just for the government to feel safe allowing him to keep test flying his own designs. But they did, and they renewed both contracts. The story here is basically the same thing I already told you a minute ago. Government contract for the war effort, made out of wood because metal was being rationed. Delayed for years and years because of Hughes not allowing a single person to touch a single bolt or electrical wire anywhere on his machine. But what a machine it was. The plane was designed to carry troops to the front lines, 700 of them. Or alternatively, it could carry 2 tanks. The H-4 Hercules, better known as the Spruce Goose, had a 321-foot-long wingspan. It was 218 feet long by 79 feet high. Before it, the biggest plane that existed was the Douglas DC-3. The Spruce Goose was over 6 times bigger. Oh, and Hughes hated when you called it that, by the way. Despite the fact that Spruce Goose only refers to this one thing, whereas Hercules refers to all of these other different Herculeses. Herculi? Hercule? It is Latin, so I guess. Turns out you can't exactly force strips of birch to grow to be exactly the same size, weight, and shape as another strip of birch. So it was an excruciating process to try and match one strip of Duramold on one side of the plane to another to keep the plane balanced. So if you were sitting there this whole time thinking wooden planes were the more environmentally friendly option, just know that a lot of trees were thrown in the trash. And the Pratt & Whitney engines were in fact not wooden and absolutely ran on jet fuel. Engines which were able to produce about 24,000 horsepower. Horses are actually believed to be able to produce about 14 horsepower each, making the Spruce Goose really equal to about 1,700 flying wooden horses. The day of its only flight was like many before it for Hughes and the media covering his escapades. Journalists flocked to the massive plane and were allowed to go inside and cruise around in taxi tests. That is when the plane is driven down the runway, or in this case sailed across the bay. All the buttons are pressed and the engine is started, commands are given to your co-pilot, everything is done as though you're going to take off, but you never actually do. The reporters then leave to write their stories, believing the whole thing will never be anything more than an extremely expensive and impractical boat. That day, 2 taxi tests were taken as normal, and before a third one, a journalist went up to Hughes and asked him, "Are we actually going to take off today?" To which Hughes responded, "No, of course not." That journalist and many others got off before that third taxi test could take place. 70 feet, 26 seconds. Barely more than twice as long as the first Wright brothers' flight 43 years earlier. It doesn't really sound like a life-changing experience, and yet, this is the one thing I've known about Howard Hughes my whole life. The man who built the Spruce Goose, the largest plane that ever flew. He got a plane big enough to itself be a small hangar off the ground. Not even off the ground, off the water. It was a boat plane just like everything Hughes built after that one tourist attraction on the Charles River inspired him all those years ago. Hughes considered this to be his biggest failure. He would work for the rest of his life on plans to make the plane fly again. At the cost of over $1 million a year in 1940s and 50s money, Hughes kept a 300-man crew year-round to make sure the H-4 Hercules was always in flight condition. And although it was certainly capable of another hop across the bay, Hughes never really cared to try. Sure, it could fly, but not in any way that would ever be of any use to anyone, outside of, I don't know, airboat tours? Maybe on a river near an Ivy League campus where the people are rich enough to pay for it? How about it, Hughes? No, unfortunately real life doesn't work out that poetically. It was never able to carry 700 troops across the Atlantic and therefore never had reason to take off again. What did take off, however, was Hughes' deep personal and financial ties with high-ranking members of the US government and its intelligence agencies. Okay, so I'm going to go over Project Azorian as quickly as I can. Even though it involved the Cold War, spies, government cover-ups, technology advancing not out of scientific curiosity, but just so that we could do something before the Russians can. Basically what I'm saying is, under normal circumstances, this would be the topic of an entire video. Unfortunately for how fun it was to look into, Howard Hughes is only a small bit player in the whole scheme. In March of 1968, the US noticed the Russian ships in the Pacific acting weird. They were breaking long-established patrol patterns that the US had noticed them sailing in for years at this point. And they seemed to be searching for something. Long story short, they had lost a nuclear sub. And no, I don't mean a submarine powered by nuclear reactors, though I believe it was that as well. I mean a submarine with armed nuclear warheads. They gave up the search after a while, seeing as the technology didn't even exist to dredge up a submarine from 16,500 feet under the surface of the water at the time. There isn't really much they could have done even if they did find its watery grave. But Richard Nixon was very interested in seeing how the Russians' nuclear technology differed from ours, and capturing nuclear warheads from the Russians was not an opportunity he was going to let go. And that is how the President of the United States came to approve an act of literal piracy.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
We are.
The CIA operation, later known as Project Azorian, would cost $800 million, or $4 billion today. This is the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a ship armed with a few new features of the time. It had a glass bottom able to open up and release a submarine out into the water beneath it. It had a claw arm capable of grabbing all the way down to the ocean's floor and dredging up material, and most importantly, it looked like crap.
I'm ugly and I'm proud. Loader! I'm ugly and I'm proud. I am ugly and I'm proud.
It wasn't the biggest ship, it wasn't the fastest, and unlike most things Hughes liked to build on the water, it couldn't fly. Why would such an ostentatious man as Hughes put his name on a vessel as bland-looking as this? Well, in addition to garnering political favor, probably also for the chance to become a literal pirate. Actually, wait, since it is government-sanctioned piracy, doesn't that technically make Hughes a privateer? To be clear, Howard Hughes had very little to do with this exercise. He was just the cover story. He told the press that he was mining for manganese on the ocean floor. And while the idea behind that was still a bit beyond their current technology, so is mining asteroids in today's day and age, and all the current billionaires are all about that. Wait, are Blue Origin and SpaceX also CIA cover stories? Moving on, the mining cover story left room to explain the giant grabby claw arm if necessary, and it would become necessary since the Soviets on 3 separate occasions boarded the ship in order to see what it was doing. Only one of the 4 claw arms actually pulled up anything meaningful, which to be fair is a hell of a lot better odds than any claw game I've ever played. With it came 2 nuclear missiles, along with several bodies of sailors who had gone down with the ship. The CIA operatives disguised as Hughes' employees gave the sailors a ceremony of last rites and buried their most likely radioactive bodies back at sea. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a video of the incident was given to the Russians so that families could have closure for what happened to the lost submariners. But in later weeks and months, when evidence started to come out that Hughes' mining operation was, for some reason, staffed entirely by CIA operatives, journalists started to notice one particular phrase coming out of the mouth of every government official they spoke to. All of them could neither confirm nor deny any of the rumors surrounding the Hughes Glomar Explorer and its supposed link to state-sponsored piracy. As such, the phrase, "I can neither confirm nor deny," became known as the Glomar response and is still used often by politicians to this day. So why did I mention Project Azorian at all, if Hughes wasn't even on the boat and simply lent his name to the mission?
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
That's why. Project Azorian is just a very small taste of the kind of insider information Howard Hughes had during the Nixon administration. But it's not like he ever did anything as groundbreaking as inventing a pillow, so how did Howard Hughes get this kind of sway with a sitting US president? Well, Hughes basically handpicked Nixon as the man he wanted in office, and he put him there. You know those antitrust laws that the government only remembers exists like every 50 years or so, and allows monopolies and oligopolies to build up in every single industry in the meantime? Yeah, so I guess it had been long enough since the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and his big rock head was at risk of breaking out of Mount Rushmore and going full socialist Godzilla on Wall Street. What I mean by that is the government was at risk of breaking up RKO Pictures, as they controlled about 1/3 of all media at the time. So Nixon, a hard pro-business conservative, was first chosen by Hughes to become the governor of Nevada. Why was Hughes living in Nevada at the time? We'll get there in like 20 minutes. Anyway, after having Nixon protect his assets in Nevada for a few years, he decided he needed his man in the White House in order to keep his multiple business empires together. He gave Nixon buttloads of campaign contributions, cash, checks, often equaling $50,000 or $100,000 at a time, dozens and dozens of times over. Of course, that wouldn't work out the first time around, considering Nixon was too sweaty and gross looking. I'm serious, that's like a genuine historical take on why Nixon lost to JFK. But money speaks louder than the will of the American public, so of course the billionaire-backed candidate just had to wait until his opponent was as ugly as him. There's no evidence they ever actually directly spoke, Nixon and Hughes. It was all money, funneled through former CIA and FBI agent Robert A. Mayhew, who was Hughes' employee at the time, who Hughes also never met in person. Mayhew funneled all of the money through a safety deposit box owned by B.B. Rebozo, a close personal friend of the president's. You can think of Mayhew as the corrupt roadie to Hughes' right-wing Iron Man. The fact that they never met was actually not all that uncommon for Hughes' employees, even his most trusted ones. Hughes was a massive germaphobe, and he didn't like touching people or shaking hands. We've long since established Hughes was a man ahead of his era. Hughes preferred to deal with everything over the phone or by passing notes to his aides. Though having that said, I think it's very funny that this guy who never met Hughes has this massive section of his Wikipedia page labeled Howard Hughes. Way to get overshadowed by your boss. Though to be fair, what else did Mayhew ever do that'd be worth noting on his Wikipedia page? Oh, a lot. It turns out he's the inspiration for the character in Mission Impossible who's like the shadowy figure behind the phone who gives out the impossible missions. I don't know, I don't watch Tom Cruise movies. So what is it that Mayhew did while working for the CIA that's so notable? Moving on. Hughes was pretty blatant in his buying favor. Checks kept pouring in long after Nixon had won the election. And by that point, they're not campaign contributions, they're just bribes. John Mayer is a former Hughes employee who I could probably do an entire video on. John H. Mayer, I should specify. After years of handling shady dealings and flat-out illegal mining schemes while working under Hughes, John Mayer took Watergate as the final straw and came clean about everything. $5 million hidden away in tax shelters in Switzerland, a complex scheme devised to force Mo Dalitz to sell the Stardust Casino, allegations that the CIA was coercing Hughes into bribing specific candidates. Look, a lot happened here. Really a whole rabbit hole we don't have time to go down here, considering it gets less and less Hughes related as more CIA and government officials get involved. Maybe another time. Mayer told his story to Playboy reporters, presumably banking on the fact that every time a senator had told their wives, "No honey, I just read it for the articles, I swear," they were lying. And yeah, I'm just as surprised as you are that anyone found him hiding in plain sight. Imagine if the January 6th committee released their final report on OnlyFans. Mayer is still to this day being sheltered by the Canadian government, who are refusing to extradite him to the United States, knowing that if he ever came back here, he would be jailed and held as a political prisoner. Which certainly lends a lot of credibility to a story that otherwise suffers from the outlet it was first reported in. If you know anything about Watergate, the phrase is "follow the money," right?
Now follow the money and see where it goes. Because every second the treasury grows.
The informant who first leaked the story under the totally not suggestive at all codename Deep Throat told Woodward and Bernstein to follow the money to find the real story. That money was Howard Hughes' money, and the $205,000 bribe to Nixon's brother was a key piece of evidence in the Watergate hearings. Richard Nixon was a paranoid psycho, and shortly before the 1972 election, he was told by an insider of Howard Hughes' inner circle that a prominent Democrat knew about bribes to Nixon's brother. And Nixon went a bit above and beyond to learn exactly what they knew. Nixon would win that election by a historic landslide, in spite of the fact that his campaign slogan, and I cannot stress enough that this is completely real, was this.
They can't lick our dick.
You know how a certain recent politician ran while stealing Reagan's campaign slogan, and just adding the word "again" to the end of the sentence? Well, I have a proposition. The Democrats knew nothing about the bribe to Nixon's brother, by the way. Nixon destroyed his entire political career because one dude bluffed and knew exactly which buttons to press. That man, John H. Mayer. Look, okay, I can't get into that whole story or we're gonna be here for 3 hours. But speaking of congressional hearings, let's turn back the clock now about 20 years to figure out just how Howard Hughes went from Iron Man to Mr. Burns between the events of World War II and Watergate.
I prefer the real.
Howard Hughes.
I said the real.
Howard Hughes.
Excellent.
So when I first heard of this bit, I was expecting some McCarthy-era communist witch hunt, considering, it was the McCarthy era, and I bet you Joe McCarthy is literally in this room right now.
I'm not even sure that's a correct statement, but the fact remains that if I made $15 million, I made it selling oil well tools and beer, grand prize beer, to people down in Texas, and I don't think that's the subject of this investigation, and I don't think the public should be led to believe that I made $15 million on war contracts when I did not.
But no, for once it was the Democrats pulling up a major Hollywood figure before Congress with the Republicans backing him. Well, some of them, we'll get to that. Anyway, these hearings were actually about all of the taxpayer money Hughes had wasted in not delivering the XF-11 and the H-1 Hercules as finished products before the war had ended. Which, yeah, fair, he's a billionaire. He can afford to pay back the grant money he wasted. Of course, at this point he was still adamant the Spruce Goose was not a failure, and in fact only a few months away from being able to help us in the next war we'd inevitably get ourselves into. But the morals of the military-industrial complex were not the only two competing sides in these hearings. You see, TWA was one of only two major airlines in the US at the time, alongside Pan Am. No, not the country from the Hunger Games. Look, neither of them still exist to this day, but apparently they were both very important before things like Delta, American Airlines, and to a drastically lesser extent Spirit existed. For 6 long days, Howard Hughes defended the plane with the bulk of the Republicans in his pocket, I mean on his side for entirely ideological reasons. The person who had supposedly orchestrated this whole thing was Republican Senator from Maine, Owen Brewster, who supposedly had heavy ties to Pan Am. By the time the hearings had ended, Hughes had not just swayed Congress, but the court of public opinion, by which I mean everyone in the country, since there were only 3 channels to watch at the time, so literally everyone knew this was going on. Brewster's political career never recovered. Of course, no matter how good he was at convincing senators, the plane was still dead in the water back home. I put the sweat of my life into this thing, I have my reputation rolled up in it, and I've stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it. So by country, it turns out he really meant state, because soon after this he would leave California for a small desert town in Nevada, able to sustain a respectable population because of the nearby Lake Mead. For now. The hearings had left a sour taste in Hughes' mouth. The aviation industry that had been his dream since he was a child ended in bitter disappointment and public embarrassment. He never fully retired from flying, and he never got rid of the Hughes Aircraft Company, but as the years went by, his visits to the hangar would become rarer and rarer. But as of 1966, Howard Hughes would sell his controlling stake in Trans World Airlines, that being 78% of the company, making himself the richest man in the world. Not wanting this deal to go down while he was still living in California, he found the nearest red state to dodge taxes in, as all billionaires inevitably do.
Inevitable.
A rural US state with a mainly conservative-controlled legislature which has formulated tax laws such that it has become a haven for businesses which employ virtually no one living here and simply register themselves as having their headquarters here, to not have to pay taxes to the liberal states they actually operate, and employ citizens within.
Actually, before we get to Vegas, we should assess his prior living situation. He would often move from hotel to hotel to either be closer to the movie set he was filming on or whatever business venture had his attention at the time. Alright, so apparently I just left in my script in insert year here, and I just never went back and fixed it. So, I guess we're rolling with it. In insert year here, he had his aides put on some movies for him at a theater he owned on Sunset Boulevard. He wouldn't leave this theater for 4 months. 4 months of which year? I don't know, neither do you. You may already know this moment in his life from this Leonardo DiCaprio meme. It's probably also from a movie. He was surrounded by a large pile of Kleenex boxes, which by this progression in his OCD, he was forced to keep constantly stacking and rearranging. Oh, and he was naked. Completely. The entire time, all 4 months. By this point in his life, he said that he felt that all forms of clothing were uncomfortable, or even painful. Hughes ate basically only candy the entire time, specifically chocolate bars. And now that I say that out loud, I realize he didn't just waste his opportunity to become Iron Man, but he also squandered his opportunity to become Willy Wonka, provided his obsession wasn't planes and movies, but rather candy, and, well, kidnapping members of indigenous people to live forever in an underground facility, never again seeing the light of day, and being forced to work and dress exactly the same, removing all sense of personal identity, and performing coordinated song and dance routines for his amusement inside a surrealist nightmare house of OSHA violations and bioweapons. Anyway, he would scribble notes to his aides on a yellow legal pad. One specifically said, "Don't look at me. Don't speak to me unless spoken to first." After this particular mental break, he would check himself into the Beverly Hills Hotel, which he stayed at for years. Wait, was he London's dad on The Suite Life of Zack and Cody? No, that wouldn't make sense. He would never allow that many people that close to him. Or was he naked under all of those bodyguards, and that's exactly why they were covering him?
But hey, that's just a theory. A film theory. And
nothing really changed for Hughes once he checked himself into the hotel. Sat naked in the dark, more handwritten notes, conducted business by phone, more drugs. Oh, he injects morphine now, so that's a thing.
Boy, that escalated
at the expected rate.
It would be in this room where he would sell his majority stake in TWA, putting an end to the aviation chapter of his life. But it wasn't exactly his choice. The OCD had become a major impediment to his professional life, and the board of TWA had long since been trying to push him out. And now Hughes believed that his business rival Noah Dietrich had been planning on using his OCD as an excuse to put him in a mental asylum if he continued at the company. If that seems like an extreme response, then maybe that's because I haven't been emphasizing that side of Hughes as much as really I should have. The FBI in 1951 said that Hughes was acting like a screwball paranoiac, which, that's a pretty cool insult. I would like to see us bring that back into modern vernacular. They were afraid he was going to
unalive
somebody, which in the early 50s might have genuinely been a concern, but after this level of physical deterioration from locking himself away from the world for so many years, he certainly did not have the strength to do so. He got increasingly detached from the world as the years went on. He would only communicate with people through notes slipped under doors because he didn't want to be touched or even looked at. And he would become violently angry if things didn't go exactly how he wanted them to go, despite the massive hoops he made people jump through to figure out what he wanted. And OCD was not the only psychological condition in which Hughes suffered. Allodynia is a condition in which people feel pain from things that should not be painful. For Hughes, it was triggered when he had his fingernails or hair cut. This, as well as other lingering psychological effects, were thought to have been the result of the XF-11 crash. Like so many other rich and powerful people who had to go on painkillers for legitimate medical purposes, he just chose to never go off of them again, and therefore the pain receptors in his body were out of whack for the rest of his life. Damn, I still haven't said a single thing about what he actually did in Vegas yet, have I? In 1966, the newly minted richest man alive rolled into Vegas on a private train wearing his pajamas. Okay, pajamas, so he wasn't naked. I thought I was going to be stuck in this outfit for the rest of the video, considering he was naked for the rest of his life. So, what did he look like? Yikes. To be perfectly fair, that is actually a photograph of actor Rip Torn playing Howard Hughes. It's just the best we have to go off of because he really didn't like photographs of him to be taken at this time in his life. And I really understand why. As soon as Hughes reached Nevada, he rented the penthouse suite of the Desert Inn, owned at the time by Moe Dalitz.
One room, please, on the top floor. What do you think you're doing?
You might remember the name Moe Dalitz as the other guy who is the most famous for building Las Vegas into what it is today. Well, this was long before any shady dealings concerning the Stardust Hotel, and instead was a case of Dalitz trying to evict the richest man in the world from a much less prestigious inn that Hughes just decided was his new home. Also, I'm done with that. Keeping these on though. Several months of squabbling with a naked man high on codeine later, and Dalitz decided to sell the hotel for $93 million in today's money, or $13 million at the time. And therefore Hughes had his new chocolate factory. Home theater. Home. He took the entire top floor to himself and his employees. He himself practically never left his bedroom. And why would he? It had a movie projector, it had blackout curtains so he never had to see the sun ever again, and it had a door to slip notes under so his employees could still do the naked man's bidding. There's a very famous story of Howard Hughes being annoyed by the bright welcome sign of an inn across the street, and buying the place just so he could dismantle it. And that story is entirely true, except for the fact that there was no way he could have actually seen that sign. The blackout curtains were always shut. He was annoyed just for the concept that that sign was there. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there, and that was keeping him up at night. A little bit more understandably, Hughes was also annoyed by earthquakes out in the Nevada desert caused by nuclear testing. And it's reported that on multiple different occasions, he offered both Presidents LBJ and Nixon $1 million in bribes to cancel the testing. Though to old Dickie Boy's credit, apparently this was not accepted. Nixon's two loves, Howard Hughes' money and nukes. Oh sure, he had a laundry list of things and people he hated, but that's all I can tell he really liked. Hughes would end up spending $300 million on property in Vegas, close to $3 billion in today's money. And if you'd thought he'd let himself go earlier in his life, well, at this point he'd taken to peeing in mason jars. And keeping them.
Sure, sometimes we eat the yellow snow.
Hughes was here in Las Vegas, Nevada in no uncertain terms but to gentrify the place. It was known at the time as a hotbed for organized crime, so Hughes decided he could clean that up by introducing white-collar crime. He bought up a ton of hotels as well as casinos in both Vegas and in Reno, but I hate gambling, so we're just gonna skip all of that.
Alright then, keep your secrets.
The actually interesting thing Hughes did while in Vegas was another major invention decades before its time. A personal Netflix account. Trust me, this is actually more interesting than listening about him building a gambling empire. Howard Hughes liked to be entertained, and, well, he found himself stuck in Vegas, a famously boring town with nothing to do and no nightlife. So to keep him company, cooped up in his room all alone, hundreds of miles away from his movie star wife who he cared about so little I haven't even had a reason to mention her yet and probably won't find one again, he bought a local TV station. Able to get around normal copyright laws by virtue of their new owner owning all of the movies they'd be playing, KLS-TV screened movies owned by RKO Pictures. And if there was a movie that Howard Hughes' company didn't own, he had the money to make that happen anyway. In his book, Howard Hughes, The Las Vegas Years, The Woman, the Mormon, the Mafia, a former KLS-TV employee said, "My job at the station was to direct the 5, 6, and 11 o'clock news, but I was also in charge of Hughes' films. Each day I would write a synopsis of the shows and movies he wanted to see and send it to him at the penthouse. Sometimes he would change his mind and call the studio or have an aide call the studio to change a movie we had scheduled to run. Indecision from the penthouse seems to be the only course of action in those days." Reminder, this was the mid-1960s. Movies and TV shows had to be prepared ahead of time by physically setting up the rolls of film you had on hand. Changing the schedule last minute would have been challenging. Hughes would call in to make them replay scenes he had missed. Not necessarily because he was actually doing something or had taken a business call. No, he was never actually busy in those days. Rather, he would just zone out and realize he had missed the last couple of scenes, or maybe he had even gotten a couple rare winks of sleep that he never really got in those days. But no, that's not good. He's missed a small portion of this movie he's already seen 12 times and maybe even personally directed. What's even worse is sometimes he'd call in the middle of a movie because he'd gotten bored with it and tell them to put on something else entirely. Which would make sense if this was a personalized Netflix account. But this is a TV station, which other people are watching. A lot of other people. There were only 3 total channels at the time. He was taking up a third of Vegas's entertainment. This was the richest man in the country who also had heavy ties to the film industry. He could have just had these film reels sitting in an empty room in the penthouse that he never used anyway, and had his aides set them up for him. Just think about the difference in technology between TV back then and TV today. Meanwhile, think about the difference in movie projectors. They were basically the same size. He was choosing to watch all this on a tiny screen, maybe even black and white, though I'm sure he had the latest in technology. I think it's really cool that Hughes was basically able to create the type of modern-day convenience we have with streaming services all the way back then. But now I also understand what drove all of the middle-aged men of Vegas out of their houses every night to drink, gamble, and do that third thing that Vegas is famous for. In insert year here, Howard Hughes left the Desert Inn without warning after years of only occasional private flights and no public appearances in over a decade. His own staff thought he was dead, only for him to turn up in the Bahamas 3 weeks later and announce that he's turning over the day-to-day operations of his businesses to the Mormons? So as it turns out, the majority of Hughes's aides for the last 20 years, basically the people who cleaned up after him, made him food, stacked his mason jars and Kleenex boxes, and saw him naked 24/7, were members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Hughes himself never was, but he did trust a select few of them enough to run his empire. I'm sure they'd been doing exactly that for several years at this point behind the scenes with absolutely no input from Hughes. He would spend some time living in London after this, where he reportedly cleaned himself up a bit. I can't tell you for sure if he was off of all of the opioids, but at least cleaned himself up to fly again. He flew completely naked, mind you, but hey, at least he landed in one piece. Maybe it was the clothes holding him back this whole time. Until an unfortunate fall in his hotel room put the idea of Hughes in the cockpit to bed for good this time. All jokes aside, this would be a devastating blow. Hughes would never walk again after that fall, let alone fly. And he returned to using opioids. Yeah, the end of the story isn't very funny. I don't know why I'm still trying to make jokes about it. Hughes spent the rest of his days in tropical paradises, locked in the penthouse suites with the windows shut and the curtains drawn, never to see the light of day, but in tropical paradises nonetheless. He spent some time in Nicaragua at a hotel he owned before experiencing an earthquake, and seeing as how much pain he was in from getting his hair cut, he realized shaking buildings weren't for him. He then spent some time in Florida, before again moving to the Bahamas, where he would spend the last 4 years of his life in the Xanadu Beach Resort and Marina. As poetically as it could have possibly ended, Howard Hughes died on April 5th, 1976, on board a private jet. He didn't crash, mind you, this time he wasn't even flying. His aides were taking him back home, to Houston, Texas, to treat him for kidney failure. Little did they know he was already home. In the sky. Our story doesn't quite end there, though. For someone as rich as Howard Hughes was, his death was going to be as expensive as his life. After Hughes's death, the biggest inheritance in the world was up for grabs. Police scrambled, contacting banks, relatives, and all of the hotels Hughes just randomly decided to up and live at for several years at a time. They posted classified ads in newspapers asking people who knew him for advice, and they even paid a psychic in order to contact Hughes's soul from beyond the grave.
Ooh, I'm contacting his spirit. He says give the money to the psychic. Ooh.
All because Hughes had failed to produce a will while he was alive. Now, several fake wills would surface, all of which ended up being thrown out in court, though some of them had more staying power than others. The one that got the furthest was the so-called Mormon will, named such because it was discovered on the desk of an official of the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City. So who did the Mormons decide they were going to give all of Hughes's money to?
You and me, but mostly me.
Now, the Mormon will does seem to be pretty balanced and fair on a surface-level reading. It allocates $1.5 billion to charity, charities that their church owns and operates. But I mean, it's the thought that counts, right? $500 million allocated to Hughes's closest aides and executives, the majority of whom were Mormon by the end of his life, and $156 million equally split between two proven ex-wives. I say proven because there were several women who had come out in later years claiming that Hughes married them in secret, and I imagine a couple of them were probably telling the truth. It also set aside $156 million for Hughes's first cousin William Lummis, who also just so happened to be the guy in charge of deciding if the will was a forgery or not. Which is why I'm surprised that in the face of a bribe that big, the Mormon will did end up being thrown out in court anyway. I'm guessing Lummis decided if the inheritance went to court with no living will, he might stand to gain more. He didn't. Also, people claiming to be the long-lost children of Hughes began to crawl out of the woodwork. And some of them were proven to be telling the truth, since, hey, now we do know what those little squiggly things the nucleus of our cells are for. Apparently they're for screwing the Mormon Church out of money.
When it comes to one-year-old Dante, Pierre, you are the father.
One person claimed to in fact be the long-lost child of both Howard Hughes and Amelia Earhart, which didn't end up being true at all, but can you imagine? The planes a child like that could crash horribly.
It's fighting, and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. Oh, the humanity.
Gas station attendant Melvin DeMar claimed that he once had driven a disheveled and hungover Hughes back to his hotel room, and Hughes was so grateful he offered him 1/16 of his inheritance, which is a lot to pay for a single Uber ride, and also weirdly specific. He didn't get any money. It's generally believed that Hughes would have wanted the bulk of his fortune to go to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and not to be spread among random relatives and executives. But as he had no written will when he died, his fortune ended up being split among over 200 different distant relatives, claimed children, claimed wives, Mormon executives, and others. And it wasn't fully settled until 2011, a full 36 years after his death. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Wait. There's a Howard Hughes Medical Institute? That means he was a philanthropist after all. I mean, not a very prolific one, and I'm sure it doesn't exactly cancel out all of the political bribes, but in the end...
I am Iron Man.
Why yes, this is extremely uncomfortable, thanks for asking. Why do I look like the nostalgia critic? Though The Outlaw would eventually be seen in theaters, it was denied its certificate by the MPAA for many years and had to bleed before release. Okay, how is my voice right now? Actually, my voice is pretty damn good. Okay, it's all culminating in a people who had yet to figure out what those little squiggly things were in the center of our nucleus of our cells were for. Anyway, that took so many tries.
Cut.